So, taking up with that, and taking up with this idea that ultimately what matters are our intentions, okay? And thinking about how these intentions are then framed and situated in such a way that we know how it is we ought to act. How is it that we ought to act? We ought to follow the moral law. What is the moral law? The moral law is the categorical imperative. This guiding principle by which we can measure our actions, measure how it is we ought to act, which hopefully habitually will be influential on our intentions. Okay. Now, you can kind of look through the rest of these lecture notes, but I want to arrive at the very last bit, which doesn't say too much. Also, it says some down here about the Nazi example. That's something I use in class occasionally. That just makes kind of Kant's challenge even more real. That, let's say, you're in Germany in the late 30s, early 40s. You're secretively hiding Jews, and the Nazis come to your door, and they say, "Hey, are you secretly housing Jews?" For Kant, you have an unqualified duty to tell the truth. It's a funny face, right? And it makes the challenge all the more real, right? What do you do in that situation? Do you lie, right, to protect yourself, to protect the folks that you're secretively housing? Do you just refuse to answer, right? Or do you tell the truth? So thinking about the first formulation of the categorical imperative, there actually is a second one. There's actually a handful of categorical imperatives, but one, over the couple of years that I've now been teaching this class, the live versions in particular, the second version of the categorical imperative I think might very well be just as important, if not more important, than the first. And that's my own opinion, and others will agree with me, other people will disagree with me. Okay? And you'll see this second version of the categorical imperative at the very bottom or the last page of your lecture notes here. Okay? And what this categorical imperative deals with is how it is we treat one another. And the first one does as well, right? I mean, the idea that stealing is a really good example of the first categorical imperative, where it would be self-defeating, that ultimately, right, if I just went and stole from you, right, ultimately what it is that I'm doing is I am instilling that is an action that could be universalized, and very quickly when we start to think about that, we recognize that again will be self-defeating, because the conception of property, the conception of ownership, again, will be completely dismantled and will be self-defeating. So similarly, not only in the first categorical imperative how it is we can treat one another, but the second one in particular deals expressly with how it is we engage with one another. Okay? Now, the second categorical imperative, the second formulation of the categorical imperative, you can also find, let's see here, just trying to see what page it is on for you all to find it. Sorry about this. I missed it. Hold on. I apologize here. Oh, that's good. Okay. Getting close. All right, there we are. So this is on the top of page 19. Sorry about that. Okay. So on the top of page 19, sandwiched in this paragraph here, okay, at the very end of this first paragraph on page 19, Kant writes the following. He says, "So act as to treat humanity," and when he says humanity, he's talking about others, humans, other humans. "So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of another, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only." Again, strange language here. But so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only. And you can see here on the bottom of your lecture notes, act as you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means, never simply as a means. And as you can see, a really easy way to understand this is Kant is essentially saying for us not to use people. Not to use people. Don't exploit others for your own benefit. Always treat them as an end and never as a means. And we heard this language when we discussed Aristotle last week, right, where we had this kind of means-end movement, right? You're taking this class to get a degree. You're using this class to get a degree or to get credit. You're using that credit to get a degree, that degree to get a job, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Similarly, with how it is we think about how it is we engage with one another, what Kant is calling our attention to here is to think about how it is we engage with one another insofar as we don't use one another. Okay? We don't exploit people simply as a means to our own benefit. Okay? Now, this is not to say that we don't have kind of means-end relational engagement, right? That, frankly, right, you and I, even though I've never seen your face, we have a means-end relationship. I am a means for teaching this class for you to gain credit for this class. Similarly, you are a means, or perhaps your parents or someone, are a means for me to have income, right? But that's a very clear kind of understanding of how this relationship works. Now, where it becomes immoral is if I only think of you as a means towards my income. That if I only view you as if I only view you as a use for me. And similarly, the way that if you were to treat me immorally, is to solely view me as a use for you. That, oh, Bryce is my teacher, right? If my humanity is reduced to the use in your life, that would be not respecting my humanity, not respecting me as a rational, capable human agent. Similarly, if I were to just say, oh, well, these students, right, I'm just making a buck off of them. Right? If I reduce your humanity to the sole use of how it benefits my life, that is being immoral. So when we think about how it is we treat one another and how it is we engage with one another, fully respecting their ability to make rational, autonomous choices, okay? Recognizing that they are indeed human actors, human, rational, capable agents in the world. And so again, this kind of connects again with lying. That for Kant, we have an unqualified duty to tell the truth, because think about it yet again. In violation of the second form of the categorical imperative, if I lie to you, right, I'm not telling you the truth, I'm deceiving you, and I'm probably using you. And this connects with that second, or with that example that we had with false promising. Okay? In Kant, this is actually a really good philosophical move, that he introduces the first formulation of the categorical imperative, gives that example. Later on, he gives the second version of the categorical imperative, and he shows how, indeed, this one, right, also violates the second formulation of the categorical imperative. And he says, he who is thinking, this is on the middle of page 19, he who is thinking of making a lying promise to others will see at once that he would be using another man merely as a mean, without the latter containing at the same time the end in himself. For he whom I propose by such a promise to use for my own purposes cannot possibly assent to my mode of acting towards him, and therefore cannot himself contain an end of this action. This violation of the principle of humanity is the other men is more obvious if we take in examples of attacks of freedom, blah, 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 and property of others. Okay? So what he's saying here, essentially, again, it's weird, challenging language, but what he's saying here is that when we make false promises to one another, right, if your roommate came to you and said, Bryce, can you spot me $400 for rent? I promise to repay you. Your roommate's using you. Your roommate is completely violating your ability to make free, informed, autonomous decisions by lying to you, by deceiving you, and from that, right, he's using you or she's using you. And very clearly and very quickly we'll say that that is immoral. And so what we get with Kant is this very challenging, rigid philosophy, especially as it's compared to Hume. Okay? Especially as it's compared to Hume. That in particular, with Kant, we have these two very punctuated and formulated principles by which to gauge action, by which to gauge intention, with how it is one ought to live. We have the first formulation of the categorical imperative, where this idea that one ought to act in such a way, act on that maxim by which at the same time you could will it to be universal law. What if everyone everywhere did as I am doing? Similarly, the second formulation of the categorical imperative with how we treat one another, right? Treat humanity, whether in your own person with how we treat ourselves or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means. Respecting them as humans, respecting them as autonomous agents in the world. Okay? And this is challenging. Because I think a lot of us would just like to live our lives kind of just doing what we do, not really caring. I don't know, just kind of going about our business, right? What does it matter? What does it matter? For Kant, it matters. Some of you might be thinking, Bryce, why would we just spend 40 minutes watching these videos when essentially what you just told me was the golden rule? Right? I'm sure some of you had that thought. And it makes sense. Kant's a theist. He's well versed in the Bible. Right? But what's interesting here is that the categorical imperatives are not just a reframing of the golden rule. The golden rule of treat others how you want to be treated, right? Which is a very fair proposition. But with various interpretations of that rule, that golden rule, right? If I find it permissible to, cut myself, then I can, justify going and cutting others, right? If I treat others how I want to be treated, and if I don't mind being hurt, mutilated, manipulated, exploited, right? Then essentially under the golden rule, in that context applies that I could go do that to others. Right? So Kant's categorical imperatives is not necessarily just a reframing of the golden rule, but rather it might be a more challenging version of it. Because what we get, right, is not just treat others how you want to be treated, but rather, what if everyone did as I am doing? What if everyone did as I am doing? What if, and could this rule or maxim be applied to all people everywhere and at all times? And moreover, am I just exploiting someone? Am I just using somebody for my own benefit? And through those questions, we might have a lot more moral quandaries, a lot more moral rigidity than we get with just the golden rule. Okay? So taking all of this into account and taking all of this into focus with Kant, we get this very, again, rigid and difficult philosophy, I think, to implement. But hopefully it leaves you with a couple of questions. It leaves you with a couple of challenges for your own life. And as you kind of work through some of this over the weekend and on the discussion board this weekend, or on the discussion board on Thursday, you'll find that this allows for some really interesting dialogue.